Good evening, friends. Let me begin by first thanking the Center for Public Policy Research for inviting me here. It's a beautiful city and a lovely time to be here. So, my sincere thanks. I want to talk about an issue that is puzzling for all of us. You would have heard just now about India being one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And if you stop to think for 2 minutes, you'll actually be hearing two stories at the same time. There will be the same newspaper talking about how India is the fast among, it's now China, but whether it's second to China or whether last year we were talking about India being the fastest, let's just say among the top fast 2 to 3 economies in the world. And at the same time, if you turn to other pages of the same newspaper, they'll tell you about how jobs are not growing, how investment is not growing, how credit is weak and credit is not growing. And it's a puzzle. How are these two things happening at the same time? I mean, if I think about an economy where investment and jobs are not growing, I would have been a little less believing of this being the fastest growing economy in the world. And yet, data shows us that it is among the fastest growing, and other data shows us that it is slowing down in a way where at least this economy hasn't slowed for many years. So what's really going on? Are the two statements compatible? Could both be happening actually at the same time? Or is it problems to do with data? So what I'm going to try to do is to first give a framework that we will use to ask this question. Then I'll try and present some data to you and come back to the question and hopefully have an interactive session with you where you can ask me questions along the way if you have any doubts. So that's what I'm going to try and do this evening. Let's try to look at growth in terms of long-term growth and growth that we are experiencing at present, or the recent growth. The framework that I'm going to use is very standard macroeconomics, which looks at business cycles around a trend. So in an emerging economy is different from advanced economies. In advanced economies like the US, UK, Europe, you would have heard things like the business cycle. Yes, the business cycle going up and down, and post 2008, there was a phase where the US economy was in a slump, where their gross domestic product or their economy was actually contracting. Emerging economies are different. Emerging economies tend to keep growing continuously, and what you see is something like this, that there is continuous growth. So if you look at the line that I have there, that is the trend line. So there is, because we are growing both due to addition to labor, addition to capital, technology, there is continuous growth. So the trend line there shows you the continuous growth that is expected to happen. We also call it the potential GDP growth. There is a cycle that you see as the blue line around that, and this is the cycle around the trend. This is there are periods when the economy is expanding more than what you would have thought the trend growth rate would allow. Then it starts contracting. It goes after passing through a peak, it goes through a period of contraction. There is a trough, and then it starts expanding again. Since 1991, after the liberalization, India has started witnessing cycles like this, often called growth cycles, or the business cycle around the trend, as the picture here shows you. We've had a period where, right after 91, there was a period of sharp expansion of the economy after about 92, 93, because all those forces that had been kept back, their investment was suddenly allowed, whereas earlier you had to get licenses, imports were allowed, whereas earlier you had to get licenses. So there was a lot of potential and there was rapid growth. So that was one phase. And then after 94, 95, when the economy grew too rapidly, there was a peak and then the economy started contracting. This contraction continued till about 99, and the Asian crisis made it worse. And then again there was an expansion of the economy. 2004, 5, 6 was the next expansion phase, which then hit the 2007 crisis and it started declining. So the Indian economy now has actually these two features and two things that are going on at the same time. There is trend growth happening, but there are cycles around this trend. Macroeconomic policy focuses on dampening the fluctuations. What does dampening the fluctuations mean? It means that the peak should not go up too much and the trough should not go down too much. So our peaks and troughs have been where our growth rate has gone up to about 10%. So the last quarter of 2007 actually witnessed 10% growth. You would have, those of you who were paying attention to this then would have heard of people saying, is 10% growth sustainable? And that was such a bizarre question because you were on the peak of a cycle. For just one quarter, you were actually on 10%. It was for an economy, China is not a market economy, so leave China out. No other market economy goes through a period of constant high growth. You have these business cycles in a market economy, and that's perfectly natural. So we went from periods when the growth was 10% to periods when it fell to 4 to 4.5%. Okay? So we've been witnessing these cycles. If I take the average growth rate of the last 15 years, I find, starting in the 92-93 period right after, then looking through the 2000s and coming up to the period now, and I take moving averages, I roughly see about 6.5% growth is what the average growth is. Whereas what actually happens if I look quarter by quarter is that there are these very sharp ups and downs. So that is the framework through which we're going to try and analyze what is happening in the economy today. Before I go further, the second thing I want to point out is that it is also that what determines these two are different. So what determines long-term growth or potential growth of an economy is different from what determines the business cycle. The long-term trend growth or the standard economic growth that if there are students of economics here would have studied in their papers on economic growth would have been additions to labor, additions to capital, total factor productivity that is determined by technological change and other efficiency improvements that happen. Whereas what determines the cycle and where you are on the cycle and the fluctuations in the cycle are determined by demand conditions, are determined by where you are on the investment cycle. So those two are actually determined by different factors. And when we try to understand where we are on the growth cycle, we'll try to look at both of them, and that's what we're going to do today. A third thing that I want to point out before we go ahead, that is part of my framework of examining this, is that actually recent research has found that the cycle or cyclical movements can affect your trend growth. What do I mean by that? If you are in a long period of recession and you're unable to get out of it, if your labor remains unemployed for a very long time, it starts having an impact on the capability of that labor to impact or to create or add to, contribute to growth. So long periods of recession actually pull down, have the ability to pull down trend growth. And so it becomes important not just to look at stories which you often hear about India being going to have one of the youngest populations in the world and so on, which contribute to long-term growth. But also it is important to look at where are we today, what are our policies today, where are we going today, and are we going to be able to tap this potential. So in summary, before I go ahead, let me just say the framework that we are going to utilize for the rest of our evening today is that the economy witnesses both trend potential, trend growth, which is the potential GDP growth, and we're going to look at what are the factors that determine it. Second, that there are cycles around this growth. And third, that those cycles can actually affect, and where you are at the cycle can affect the long-term trend growth that the economy may witness. Now let me begin with the long-term trend growth for the Indian economy and where we see this growth going. The major contributors to long-term growth for economic progress and economic growth in any country are labor, capital, and productivity growth. And to give you a preview of what we will find, India has advantages on all three, major advantages on all three. We have a young demography, and not just in terms of quantity of the number of people, we are going to actually see these young people year after year are better than the previous set of young people. So not only are they more in numbers, but every year the number of educated ones, the number of skilled ones are greater than the number of the previous year. In terms of capital, our capital stock is growing very steadily and rapidly despite all the changes that and the slowness that we've seen in recent years. So far, I'm not saying we're perfect, but it is a very good scenario. And third, there are numerous drivers of productivity growth in this economy, coming from adoption of technology, growth of infrastructure, telecommunications, improvements in policy, improvements in health, education. So there are numerous drivers of productivity growth. So overall, the potential, I'm not saying the actual, I'm saying the potential GDP growth for this economy and the long-term trend growth for this economy can be very high. What are these factors? Let's start with labor. Where do we stand? Okay. This graph shows you, it's talking about the quality and quantity of labor. So the working age population has been rising. Currently it is at about 65% of the population, and it will keep rising for the next few years. If I look at the quality of the labor force, in 1980 our literacy rate was 41%, and today's or the data that one has, latest data, the literacy rate is about 72 to 73%. This literacy rate is over the next few years going to increase and reach 100%. We can argue about how good our schooling is, how good our education system is, but even a few years ago, it's not that the definition of literacy was not different. Then also it was people who could sign their names. Today also it is people who can sign their names. So if by the same definition you have more numbers, even that is giving you an advantage. Years of schooling, very low. Again, lots to, there are lots of gaps, but note that coming from 1980 to 2014, the multiple times improvement. So that is the quality and supply of labor force. We are going to get a rapid improvement in literacy, especially after the 100% enrollment or almost 100% enrollment that we have in primary schools all over the country. About 10%, so even going beyond literacy, about 10% of our workers today is that every single person who will enter the labor force will be literate. Today, if someone cannot read an on-off switch compared to somebody who can read an on-off switch, that changes the capability of the labor force significantly. Double the number of people will be graduates. I'm sure every single person in this room would like to argue with me about the usefulness of doing a graduation in India. Yes, you will say, oh, but we don't learn this and we don't learn that, and what good is graduation if we can't get jobs? And I mean, I am 100% certain that every single person here would like to quibble with me about this. But compare that to people who've not been to college and not been to school. And all the limited point I'm making here is that you still get some exposure. So just simply going from 10% to 20% is a significant improvement. And these improvements are going to continue. Let's look at a few numbers here. So what does this number show you? It shows you the literacy rate and how that has changed. And the most important line I want to, the blue line shows you where we are today. And then beyond that, I have projections for the literacy rate. And I think this state is one where you've already achieved more than what the rest of the country has. And you would agree with me that one of the most important contributors to society, to life, to standard of living, to GDP growth and productivity is female literacy. And the country is going to rapidly move towards 100% female literacy in the next couple of decades. And that is going to actually change and improve the contribution of labor to GDP growth far more than perhaps just the numbers that we have seen in the past. We have more literate workers, as I said, even being able to read an on-off switch, being able to follow instructions, makes them far more capable. So in terms of contributing to growth, it is a it's a sea change. It's not just that I get 5 more people who can read and that makes a small difference. No, it's like a 0-1. It is a switch from not being able to employ a literate person to being able to employ a literate person. And we are going to have far more literate people. This graph shows you how many people would have finished high school. And again, you see this rapid increase that has been happening in recent years because we had this earlier program of pushing everybody into schools. We went through that, enrollment increased, and then we are going through this phase when those children are going to secondary school and then to higher school, and we are going to get a period when we will have school leavers. Not only will we have a labor force that is literate and that can attend school, at the same time we are getting a very at the other end of the spectrum. We are getting. Can people recognize this picture? So everyone recognizes this picture, the Mangalyaan picture. So we have a high-end scientific and technical labor force that is one of India's biggest advantages. And in the global space, we have this advantage, which again gives us something that can potentially. Now, we are talking about potential growth, remember? I mean, I don't repeat the word potential, I often call it trend, but all these factors that I'm talking about are about potential growth. Potential is what is possible, not necessarily what is going to happen. We'll come to that later. But potentially, gives us a huge advantage in the world. Not only should the labor force be educated, it also needs to be healthy. If people are falling sick all the time, if morbidity does not reduce, if people are falling ill, they cannot make the same contribution to GDP growth that they can if it is a healthy workforce. Various indicators suggest that slowly, very slow progress, we would have liked it to be faster, but there has been progress on improving the health of the labor force. So we not just just get a more educated labor force, we get a healthier labor force. So on labor, while we may have all our quibbles about the quality of labor, while we may have worries about the pace at which health is improving, but net, the potential GDP growth that we will get or can get from the contribution of our demographics is huge. In fact, we will be the country with the bulk of the young labor force because of China's one-child policy. Their labor force is not large. We will be the country with the largest young labor force in the whole world. This will be literate. This will have passed high school. Many of them would have been technically they would have been technically educated in technical and scientific skills. So that potential is huge. Let me now turn to the other factor of production, which is absolutely essential for long-term potential growth, and that is capital. I'm in this graph comparing India's growth in capital stock. So what is the stock of capital that we have? Uh, so the y-axis here shows you an index where I've put it all to 100, taken a number of countries, India, Brazil, Great Britain, Japan and Mexico, put the index to start at 100 in 91 so that they all start together so that we can compare them, otherwise their levels of capital stock are very different. So if you want to look at growth and how countries are moving, then it is necessary to make it comparable. So this is an attempt to make it comparable. Okay? So what do we see? We see the black line at the top is the growth in capital stock in India. The compare and contrast it with other emerging markets. So the red line just below it is Brazil. The brown line is Mexico. And then in advanced economies, the growth in capital stock slows down much more because they're not growing that fast and they've already built what they need to build. So, you know, the London Metro was built, what, 150 years ago, whereas we are still building metros in India. So it's it is natural that in advanced economies, the growth in capital stock is much slower. Japan, of course, it's not just lower, it's falling off. So Japan is a different story, not to discuss here, but just to give you a sense that you can put as many more countries on this chart as you like. India still remains on the top. I tried a few more, but you know, then the graph gets very cluttered. But I wanted to show you that despite all our difficulties, we still managed to add to our capital stock at a very fast pace, so all the way from 1991. And capital stock is what allows you to, I mean, it's a factor of production, so you have a machine and you have labor, and that's what gives you GDP growth. The concern, of course, and I'm bringing this in right here, is that towards the end, you will find that there is the slope of the line at the end is not as fast. That it is not, can you see this kink in the black line? That it goes like this and then it slows down like this. So that kink or the slope becoming flatter is something that has happened in recent years, and that the recent years have been post 2011-12. So in 2011-12, a lot of projects got into trouble. Today we are seeing those projects also ending up as non-performing assets of banks because they had taken loans from banks and they were not able to get off the ground, and therefore they were not able to return those loans. But that is the kink that you see in the growth in capital stock happening in the previous graph, which is because a lot of projects got stuck. And this graph is actually showing the value of all projects under implementation. So you see that period of period of growth where they were rising, and now you see the flat line on the top where they have pretty much stopped growing that rapidly and have stagnated. A third way of looking at the same thing. So we are looking at the addition to capital stock. Okay, we've looked at the total growth in capital stock. We've looked at what is happening to projects under implementation. A third way of looking at it is if you look at the addition to capital stock by summing up all fixed assets of large firms. So there is a database of large firms, prowess, by the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. In that database, we put together all the fixed assets of they have about 8,000 companies. So take those 8,000 companies, add them up, and see how that has been moving. So, which is primarily the formal sector. That's not the informal sector, and we look at how that is growing. And you will find that that is also growing, and pretty much towards the end, it has slowed down. So that's the picture of addition to capital stock. In summary, has been growing well since 1991-92. We see some slowing of the pace of the addition to capital stock in recent years. So that's the summary of what is happening to the second big contributor to growth, which is capital. Let me now turn to productivity. This is not a technical analysis of productivity. Productivity can be measured by a third factor. You put the same amount, suppose you double capital and you double labor and output more than doubles. So there's been something else that has happened. What could have happened is technology, management, change in the practices that you follow, infrastructure available to you. A number of things could have happened because of which your output more than doubled when you doubled labor and capital. This is not a full story. I'm just going to give you some anecdotal evidence that the things that contribute to productivity have all been chugging along, some fast enough, some not that fast. One of them is infrastructure. Infrastructure growth has been happening. We all know about computerization. We all know about mobile telephony. Mobile telephony improves everybody's productivity. Even if you think of the local plumber who used to be able to do 2 jobs, can now do 5 jobs because he's able to coordinate on the mobile phone. So there have been huge improvements in the last few years. Infrastructure is one of the major contributors. If there's no road, you're hardly going to be very productive in a remote area. We've had huge projects under implementation, slowed down a bit towards now, but that continues. One of the major, the contribution to infrastructure comes from many things: roads, railways, bridges, airports, urban transportation. So I've got some sense here we can get of what and how urban transportation has been growing rapidly. And we see that these are the number of, this is metro lines in 11 cities summed up. And the red line is where we are now. And these are the number of kilometers that have been added. And the line after the red line, the sharp increase, is actually kilometers that are going to be added. So it's not projects that have been announced or are being envisaged, but projects that are already commissioned and under implementation. So this is what is going to happen. This is like deterministic rather than an estimate. So to give a broad sense of trend potential growth rate, the outlook on capital is positive, on labor is positive, on productivity is positive, and therefore the long-term growth trend prospects, the prospects are very good. Of course, we could be complacent. A lot of stories you will hear, India will benefit from the demographic divide, and so we're going to do very well, and we can actually be not worried, all is well, and we are going to be the fastest growing economy in the world. China is going to slow down. IMF and people like that always help by saying, oh, you will be growing this year at 7, next year at 8, third year at 10, and whatever else. The question is, can we afford to be complacent? Are these projections based on the long-term trend growth projections, potential growth projections, which most models use? Or is it that there is something else going on which we need to be very careful about, and which could actually impact these long-term growth hopes that we have? And this is where I'm going to turn to where we are on the business cycle. So the potential growth looks very good. We could have very high growth rate, but where are we today on the cycle, and what is the current state of the economy? So this is on the fluctuations around that trend growth, which are where we actually are, and then try and put those two together and try and understand, so where might we go? This is quarterly GDP growth rate. If you look at the last, so first let me just point to you from 2013-14. You would see the economy going up. Just the second half, if you will, with me, look at the second half of the graph. You'd see it goes up, but the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines are actually coming down like this. So this is the quarterly GDP growth rate in real terms of the economy. And this growth rate has been declining. The question that I'm posing is, can we try to understand something from this, that this has been continuously going down, and does it indicate or give us a reason to not be complacent? Also, when we look at other data, there's a lot of data that is not supporting that healthy, happy view that we are going to grow at 7, 8, or 7.8 that people are projecting for us. If I look at data on industrial production, that's not looking very good to me. This is the data on the index of industrial production, year-on-year growth, and that again, if you look at the last period, you will see that that is showing us a decline. A third series that one looks at in trying to figure out what is happening is net sales of firms. As I said, there is a database of formal sector firms, the Pravis database, and the way we looked at gross fixed assets of those firms, we can also look at net sales of those firms. The question is simple. What are we asking? Are the big companies of India selling well? Are their their sales growth increasing? And what does this graph show you? You look at the gray, particularly the gray period, growth of net sales. This is annual average growth, is between 0 and 5%. Okay? Now, in nominal terms, if there has been a 3% increase in prices, even if I take the latest numbers, then that tells me that real growth is barely about 2%. So companies are really not able to sell their products. Are people borrowing? Bank credit is often for working capital. And in periods of high growth, bank credit grows very fast. If you look at the first half of the graph, you'll see that in the quarter that I referred to you earlier, which was the last quarter of 2007, bank credit was growing at something between 30 and 35%. I mean, that was overheating, that was too fast. But what I want you to look at is that when the economy is doing well, when it is on the high of a cycle, bank credit growth picks up, and when it slips down and when business is slow, bank credit growth slips down. So when we try to understand where we are on the cycle, this is one of the most important indicators that we look at. This is the total all banks put together, their credit given to the commercial sector. The series is given by RBI, and you look at the bank credit growth. Focus on the right side of the graph now, where I've just marked it with a gray box, gray background, and that again shows you the decline that is happening, the continuous decline that is happening in the last few years, particularly after 2011-12. Let me refer back to the other series that I've just mentioned earlier, which is projects under implementation. This is a series produced by CMI, again, the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, in a database that is called CAPEX, which is capital expenditure, putting together every single project that for which news is available. So these are formal sector projects, so there might be an announcement, or the company might say that I've started this project, so there are projects under implementation, there are projects that are announced. And this is a graph of the projects under implementation. Look at how it goes up and then comes down. It goes up in periods of high activity when people start implementing projects, and this is a stock of the this is a growth rate of the stock of projects under implementation, and that growth rate has collapsed again since 2011-12. This is about investment. Is investment happening? Capital investment, capital expenditure is investment, and this is all projects put together. You can, in this database, you can narrow down to, okay, where, which project, what is the location, what is the company, what is the investment about, and so on. So it's really micro data, and this is summing up all the micro data to try and see, so is investment happening? And this graph tells you no. So what is the picture that emerges? The picture that emerges till now is that on potential growth rate, we are a country with great potential. But where we are today is that we are at a business cycle downturn. Almost all data that one looks at for business cycles is indicating that we are not, it is not even saying that the trough is past. It is not in the period of pickup. The pickup has yet to happen. We are still somewhere at the bottom now. Whether I'm looking at credit, whether I'm looking at sales, whether I'm looking at investment, whether I'm looking at industrial production, we are in a period of a business cycle slump, pretty much. And this is the cycle around the trend. So don't let the confusion of, oh, but we are at 6.2 in terms of GDP growth rate enter this discussion. Yes, we are not at zero growth rate, but compared to the potential, we are much, much lower than we could be. So let me turn to the question of how will this affect, can this affect, let's not say will and be deterministic, but can this affect the long-term potential? So what do we think when we think of how the economy might grow? The first thing to look at would be investment. As we saw, the capital stock was growing, but as I pointed out to you, if investment does not pick up, capital stock cannot keep growing. Capital stock investment is additions to capital stock. For the economic students here, it's KT minus 1. That's what your IT is. So if I look at gross fixed capital formation as a percentage of GDP, and this is using CSO data this time. So, many different data sources saying the same, telling us the same story. This is CSO data. The percent to GDP in where GFCF or gross fixed capital formation has been going down. The year-on-year growth rate has been going down clearly. In particular, so till now I was talking about total numbers, public plus private. Okay. Public investment, there has been a push to public investment in the last 2-3 years. So the budget of 2016 particularly tried to push public investment and public investment in, they talked about, the budget speech talked about pushing public investment in infrastructure and in railways as a way to give a fillip to investment because of the slowdown in investment that you saw. Government only has limited capacity to increase public investment because if you increase it too much, that means you'll be borrowing. You can increase taxes only up to a certain amount, and if you try to go beyond that, that means you'll be borrowing. If you are borrowing to increase public investment, then you might end up crowding out private investment. So your net effect, you take away the resources that people might have put into private investment, or you will raise the interest cost if the government borrowing increases too much. Today it is even more complicated because if you go in for a large fiscal deficit, your credit rating might fall. If your credit rating falls, then though the government does not borrow in international markets, but private players borrow and their cost of borrowing goes up. So in short, the government only has a limited ability to increase public investment. It cannot in India be the big force that is going to keep on investing more and more. That is why you find that even with this, I'm going back to the previous figure, that even after 2015, in the 2 years when every budget speech, every statement from the government, from the chief economic advisor is saying, oh, we are increasing public investment and that is the engine of growth, you're finding a decline in gross fixed capital formation. Okay? So in short, the limited capacity of the government to increase public investment must be kept in view. Yes, there can be some increase. Ideally, what we would like to see is that when the government increases its investment, it crowds in private investment. It could be because it gives out contracts and there's a multiplier effect. It could be that it creates infrastructure and it is infrastructure that gets more private investors to start wanting to do investment. But that has not happened yet. If I look at projects announced by the private sector, this is announced. The stage of announcement comes before the stage of implementation. So in any project, first, it is conceived of and it is announced that we are going to do this project in collaboration with so and so. We'll borrow from such and such. This and such will be the location of the project. Over the next, sometimes 1 year, sometimes 2 years, the project starts getting in place. It gets the money, it gets the permissions, it gets the land permissions or whatever else it requires, and then after about 1.5 to 2 years on average, the project starts getting implemented. So the announcement must happen for the implementation to happen a year or two down the line. And for the implementation to come a year or two down the line, that is when investment will pick up. My question therefore is, has the private sector started announcing more projects? Because if it does not announce more projects today, investment is not going to pick up tomorrow. It first must announce, and then a year or two later, investment will happen. Scarily enough, if you look at this graph, the projects announced by the private sector have not just fallen, but are showing no signs of pickup yet, despite the last 2 years of public investment increase. And the public investment has increased a little, but private investment has yet not responded. And mind you, almost deterministically, I can say that if the announcement has not happened yet, investment is not going to happen next year. So it's a graph that causes a lot of concern. Where does that leave us? If, and I'll just stay at this graph, if this does not pick up, then growth in the economy, despite all the potential, could actually taper off. We've had this, we have had many policy changes, perhaps more policy changes in a short period of time than the private sector liked to see, because it also induces policy uncertainty. Sometimes it is very good that there should be change, but sometimes that also induces uncertainty. We've also had a move to the formal sector, both through the attempt of demonetization and GST. That is primarily an attempt to rapidly transition the economy, an economy which has a very large informal sector, into the formal sector. And that's again perhaps a cause of uncertainty. We've had changes in tax administration, we've had changes in tax laws, more powers being given to tax officials. While there have been a lot of changes in permissions being given, but the regime essentially has not changed. Law and order still remains a problem in many parts of the country. Contract enforcement remains a big problem because courts take a very long time. And if one puts all this together, and the net effect is that private investment is not picking up, okay, can the economy pick up? And that leaves us with a very with an issue of concern, and that issue is, do we even know what exactly needs to be done? Do we even know what are the set of policies? Each one comes up with the blind men and the elephant. That, okay, it is this thing that's going to fix everything, or it is that is going to fix everything. But there is no clear, comprehensive set of, neither from the government nor from the critics. So this is not that I'm saying that we have all the answers, or the government has all the answers, or anybody else has all the answers. But that leaves us with a very disturbing situation, that at the moment where we are standing, we cannot afford to be complacent. We are an economy with great, great potential, but there are so many things that need to be done before we can actually achieve that potential. And I'm going to stop there and take questions. Thank you.